excuse not to achieve what we might have achieved. We'll have the ability to blame racism on why we're not doing right by our women folk. And yet, part of being a full-grown man is understanding that although we did not choose our history, we can make our history. We may not have chosen the circumstance into which we were born, but we can determine the circumstances that we live. We can't make excuses all the time for not acting right. And I see that all the time, making excuses. I see folks, I'm a politician, so people are always complaining about something. They come to me, they say, why our alderman, he ain't nothing. I ain't gonna vote because he don't do nothing. I say, well, somebody put him in office. That do nothing alderman. I'm not saying, by the way, your alderman. He may be perfectly good. I don't want a scandal here. But somebody put him in office, or if you didn't vote, then you put him in office, even if you thought you didn't. People talk about, there's redlining in our community center. Why is it our commercial strips, 79th Street and Michigan Avenue, all those, how come they don't look like they do on the north side? I said, well, I tell you what, there's been a long history of redlining, banks and insurance companies not reinvesting in our communities. I've been working to pass legislation and fight legislation at the state level and the federal level to make sure that the Community Reinvestment Act puts money back into our communities. But I say, what would be a good economic development plan? Is if when folks are walking down the street or driving by, they don't just throw their McDonald's right out on the street, or their broken bottles out on the street, urinating out on the street. Nobody wants to shop if you got to step over 40-ounce bottles in the neighborhood. You got to take responsibility for our actions. And sometimes when I say that, well, that's because, we ain't getting city services. I say, well, all right, that may be true too, but I tell you what, if you can find me that garbage truck that comes at 2 or 3 in the morning and dumps all that garbage, maybe white folks are doing it. Maybe they're coming in when we're sleeping and scattering all this trash everywhere. And if you catch these folks, you let me know. You let me know. Taking responsibility for your actions. Brother Johnson mentioned my speech at the Democratic National Convention. With respect to education, we know that our children's future is in education. The days where you could walk into a steel mill and if you had a strong back and were willing to work, that you would be able to support a family, those days are over. Our children are competing against not just folks in Indiana or New Jersey, our children are competing against folks in China and Shanghai and Bangalore, Maine. Which means we have to achieve the highest educational levels. It's not enough, sometimes, and I've got to say this, sometimes I go to an 8th grade graduation, and there's all this pomp and circumstance and the gowns and the flowers and it's just the 8th grade, people. That's not enough. They got to get out of high school, then they got to go to college, then they got to get a graduate degree if they're going to compete. Don't make them feel important just for graduating from 8th grade. We got to have higher sights than that. An 8th grade education is not going to cut it. It's not going to cut it. Just give them a handshake. Congratulations. Now get your butt in the library, because you're about to go into 9th grade. So, when I talk about education, I'm serious. And I know that our schools don't have all the equipment that some school out in Naperville has. I understand that. I understand that the school financing system in this state is screwed up. We got to fix it. I understand that. I understand that our teachers need more money. And I understand that we need more computers and equipment. I understand all those things, but let me say this. There is no excuse. Because I know that if you put some Asian children in these same schools with these same books and these same computers, they'd be doing just fine on those SATs. And the reason is because they don't take any excuses. We have to get beyond making excuses if we're going to be full grown. I've only got a few more minutes, so let me just mention two last things. The first is that to be full grown, you have to live out your values and teach your children to live out your values, not just giving lip service to your values. You know, you can tell what's important to somebody, not by what they say, but by what they do. Where do they put their money? Where do they put their energy? Where do they put their time? And that's how you know what's important to them. So brothers, if you say that your family is important to you, but every weekend you're out playing golf 10 hours a day, and when you get home, you go down into the basement and you're watching television, then you got to ask yourself, how important really is your family? If you say that education is important to you, and yet you are spending your money not putting it into a savings account for your child to pay for that college education, but you're spending that money out on the boat, you've got to pass on your values and live out your values. Your children will be watching you at all times. And one of the values that I think men in particular have to pass on is the value of empathy. Not sympathy, empathy. What that means is standing in somebody else's shoes, being able to look through their eyes. You know, sometimes we get so caught up in us that it's very hard to see that there are other people and that your behavior has an impact on them. And sometimes brothers in particular don't like to feel empathy, don't like to think in terms of how does this affect other people, because we think that's being soft. There's a culture in our society that says we can't show weakness and we can't therefore show kindness, that we can't be considerate because sometimes that makes us look weak, that we can't listen to what our women have to say because we don't want to act like they in charge. And yet, and our young boys see that. They see when you are ignoring your wife. They see when you are inconsiderate at home. They see when you are thinking only about yourself. And so we've got to learn to pass on the value of kindness. One of the things that I learned about being a man is that you're not strong by putting other people down, you're strong by lifting them up. You don't realize your full potential as a man if all you're doing is looking out for yourself. You realize it by giving something back. And I say that not just because we have a debt to those who helped us get to where we are, although we do have that debt. It's not just because we have an obligation to those who are less fortunate, although we do have that obligation. It's primarily because we have an obligation to ourselves. I don't know anybody who is significant only thinking about themselves. You're significant because you hit your wagon to something larger. You're significant because you are serving your community, and you're serving your church, and you're serving that little league team, and you're serving your God. That's what makes you significant as a man. And so let me just end by suggesting that the last thing that's required for being a full-grown man, I think, is hope. Believing in things not seen. You know, in Romans chapter 8, verse 24, it says, "We are saved by hope. But hope that is seen is not hope. For what a man seeth, why doth he yet hope for?" Sometimes when we think about our history, our own personal history, not having a father in the house, our collective history, seeing what's been done to African American men in this society for so long, it's hard to feel hopeful sometimes. And yet, Scripture reminds us that what makes hope hope is that you can't see it right there. You may drive through the west side or the south side or the south suburbs and see young men standing out on the street corners and know that they're engaged in the drug trade and know that there's violence and despair, and you know that we have more young African American men in prison than we do in college, and sometimes the statistics can overwhelm you. And yet, it seems to me that the greatest gift we can pass on to our children is understanding that God is looking after us in this difficult journey. And that even if we don't realize it, there's a plan for us. And that if we do what we must do, if we live up to his creed, if we try to be true to the example of our Father on high and use the gifts that he's given us, then not only can we be full grown, but ultimately we can raise the kinds of young men that will make us all proud. God bless you, Christ University. Thank you very much.